Well, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you're really enjoying TROPT this week. Um, I'm Robin Andruss, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a minute, and so will Mary. But today's session is about thinking about your privacy program as a product. And the reason this idea came about is because I'll introduce myself real quick, but I'm currently the director of data privacy governance and data protection officer at Twilio, and I've been in the privacy space now for 14 years, Google, Yahoo trustee. And, I work closely with a lot of product managers through my years. And I kind of thought, like, why don't we run privacy programs more like product managers? They're so efficient and effective, and they're really thinking about building the right thing for their customers. And so I'm really excited to be here and to talk with all of you on this panel. And I'll let Mary go ahead and introduce herself. Excited to have Mary here as well.
Hi, everyone. Just a second. We're learning the logistics here. Okay. Hi, I'm Mary Berk. I am a lifelong product manager. And before my current life, I was an academic. I have a PhD in ethics. So I'm an ethicist, and privacy is my absolute passion. I've been doing product management for a long time now, startups, large companies alike, and I am currently teaching product management at University of California at Berkeley in the MBA program. So really looking forward to just diving in, sharing some product management basics, but also really hearing what people out in the audience are dealing with and how we can support you.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here with you and humble of your teaching and learning more from you, working with you over the last couple of weeks on this panel together. So let's go ahead and jump in. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to be marrying product management and privacy program management in a way. So we're going to, go into Mary's mind and learn about thinking about a product leader and building a product from a product manager's perspective. Then we'll shift a little and talk kind of about like the core elements of a privacy program. And it's going to be a fun interactive exercise where we're going to try to apply the framework to your privacy program. So if anyone out there is thinking, they have a sticky work stream they're trying to think about right now about how to fix it or how to improve it or build a privacy feature, let's put that in the chat and we can kind of walk through that. Thank you. So what is a privacy program anyway? That's why we're all here today, right? Really at the end of the day, it could take a variety of forms. It is, to meet compliance regimes, but you need to comply with privacy laws, demonstrate reasonable protection measures, but there is really a lot of things it could also be. Like you could think of a privacy program as, showing your customers that you're doing the right thing and increasing revenue or sales of your business, as well as the minimizing risk side. And then within the product privacy program, there is certain work streams, deliverables that need to be conducted. Let's say, we've got a vetting process like a privacy vendor review, making sure that we look at the contracts, the process around reviewing contracts. A DSAR, that's a big kind of putting in a DSAR authorization process is a big deal for a lot of companies. Cross-functional team, like how you're looking at launches of products on a regular basis, and then much more. So with that, I'll let Mary take it from here and talk more about the product management mindset.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give you a crash course in product management. I'm assuming that lots of you are already familiar with this. So the intent is just to set some context and establish a framework for thinking about anything that you do from a product management perspective. So it is actually super simple in principle, which is not the same as doing it in practice, but it goes like this. Start from where you are. Get really honest about what's working, what's not, whether you have anything in place, whether you don't. Define where you want to go. Define what excellence looks like. Come up with a plan to close that gap. Measure how you did. Reevaluate how you're doing. Do it all the time, and then go back to the beginning. It's that simple. It's identify where you are, figure out where you want to go, come up with an increment-based plan to close the gap, measure, lather, rinse, repeat. The hard part about all of this is that every single piece of that requires a substantial amount of discipline, rigor, self-examination, data, honesty, being open to challenge, being told that you're wrong. So just the simple act of coming up with the right measure for your privacy program can, I've been at companies where we spend 6 months and put an entire team on it, trying to be really honest about what measure identifies how we're doing and how we want to measure ourselves going forward. So these things can be very challenging in practice. Let's go like a level deeper on this. So if step 1 is define the problem space, you're really asking what matters to me and to my company at this time, or to my program at this time. So are you trying to comply with regulatory requirements? Do you have a customer trust problem? Are you trying to reduce costs while still maintaining regulatory compliance? Some combination of the above, or something completely different. And then it's also really important to identify what you're optimizing for. It's impossible to optimize for all things at all times. And when you know what you're really aiming at, then it makes it much easier later in the game to identify your priorities. When you've got 15 things you could do and you know what you're optimizing for, you can pick the 2 that actually matter instead of being distracted by the 13 that don't. Identifying what you must get right, and then especially identifying how you are currently doing. A lot of people will tend to delude themselves here. They're invested in what they've already got, and so they don't want to acknowledge the chinks in it, but it's really important to be honest with how you're doing. Do research to validate your findings, and what that actually means is try to prove yourself wrong. So be open via scientific method type exploration to trying to prove yourself wrong in terms of where you think you are and where you think you ought to be going. And then find objective measures. So the second bit is defining a strategy. So you know what you're trying to optimize for, you know how you're currently doing, and now you have to ask yourself very honestly, what are the top 2 to 3 big problems I need to solve in order to advance my strategy against the problem space that I've defined? So one example of this could be simply, I'll just read it. To advance our goal of an audit-proof compliance process, the 2 most important problems to solve now are creating a trail demonstrating our actions and empowering our support reps to hit a 2-day SLA. So a strategy is about identifying the 2 to 3 biggest things that you need to accomplish now. And each of those things might take 10 individual initiatives to accomplish. But a strategy is a big problem statement about here's something that we don't have right that we need to get right. And now you can develop initiatives underneath it. So that is your strategy. Everything that you do in your program should map to your strategy, and other items become low priority. So this is just simply goal-driven prioritization, or what you hear from companies, prioritize relentlessly. Your PRD, or your product requirements document, from a product perspective, is taking what you know about your strategy, identifying the massive list of initiatives that can help you advance it, and then pick the top ones. And those are your first things to do. So you design the things that you're doing with goals in mind, and you prioritize relentlessly, and then you build measurement in. So if you'll notice so far, each step here refers to the previous step. So your PRD, which is the first thing you do, which honestly toward the example of this goal could be build an Excel spreadsheet to log our actions. That could be your first thing that you do. That could be the process that you design. But that maps back to your strategy, which you know that you need an audit-proof compliance framework, and you need to hit a 2-day SLA, and that maps back to the problem space that you've already defined. So everything is nested and carefully thought out. And then the next thing to do on your mission here is you've built your V1, so now think about what the future looks like. That's your roadmap. You know your problem space, you have a strategy, and you have a V1. So you ask yourself, did V1 move the needle? If not, figure out why. If so, fantastic. You want to do more of that. So you might have a list of 15 things that you want to do here on your roadmap. You want to prioritize the top 3 to 6, depending on your team capacity. And your team might be you in your spare time, so that's not a lot of capacity. But this process is very simple, and it's very nested. Understand the problem space, understand your strategy for moving forward in the problem space, identify what you do first, and then identify what you do next. I saw there's a chat. Yes, this will be available afterwards, and it's full screen on my end. So if someone can't see, feel free to pop things into the chat, and I'll happily troubleshoot. Okay, let's play with an example very quickly of just operationalizing the framework. You've got you've done your analysis, your research, your self-assessment. You've identified a core program need of establishing an enduring program to demonstrate legal compliance for CCPA opt-out processes. you've identified your current gaps. You don't have an actual opt-out process, which means there's no way to track customer inquiries, which means anything that you do might live in a local spreadsheet if it lives anywhere at all. And then you ask yourself, how do you know? You're identifying your measures. And the current situation is you have no measures. You know that your Yelp reviews are terrible, and you've had a couple of complaints against you at the California Attorney General office. So that's your current state. Pretty big problem. Your strategy going forward, and again, this is your top problems to solve to address the problem definition that you've just created. You might make it really simple. Establish an accessible customer request process. Set up an email address and put it on your website. There, that's your V1. Empower your ops team with a tool to help them manage requests. Another idea, we've got the numbering wrong here, is ensure centralized repository of requests and actions. So it doesn't just live in a spreadsheet. It's got some central store, and that could be any variety of central stores. And then establish a weekly metrics report so that you can monitor yourself, keep yourself honest. Step one to advancing your strategy is say you create a centralized email inbox to receive and respond to customer complaints. There, that is centralized, it's auditable, it might be messy, but your process now exists and you can track what you've done with some extra labor. You ask your support team to enter requests into a central spreadsheet. There, that is also centralized and now it's measurable. So you can run reports from a spreadsheet. So that's simple. That's your V1, that's your PRD. And then you think about, great, what do I want to do for the future? And you go back to the beginning and ask yourself what you need to do to move forward, and you come up with a more advanced version of the same. You set up Zendesk so that you can have a more tailored customer response, and you can build data and measurement inside of it with reason codes. And then you build maybe your V2 is build an automated handling process. So you get an email, you get a request, and now a process kicks off in the back end to handle it for you so you don't need manual intervention. And then you automate reporting. So that's just a simple overview of how I might tackle this particular problem from a product management perspective. And as you can see, it's not rocket science, but it does require a lot of rigor. And you're always starting with, what problem am I trying to solve? Why does this matter? How am I doing? And how can I move the needle forward? Just very briefly, going an inch deeper, we've talked about the PM process. Now here's the PM mindset. And this is PM leadership mindset. You're always asking hard questions. You're not looking for the easy way out. You are always curious. You're always rigorous. You're always humble. You're always looking for better. But just because you're not at perfection now doesn't mean that your search for better is a form of criticism of your team or of yourself. It's just this drive for always doing better. Openness and collaboration is really key. When you bring your entire team into the problem space so that they understand what you're trying to do, why it matters, they can contribute to it, then what you get is a team that is motivated to solve a problem and invested in the solution. And there's a lot of satisfaction in that. So you really double your ability to have impact when your team is brought in and you bring in your team by being open and collaborative. The next part of the PM mindset, this is really hard for a lot of people, but you're constantly trying to make progress now while also holding on to your vision for the future. So it's this constant navigation between, what do I have to do today to move forward? What matters tomorrow and what matters in 3 years? It's really tricky. It's hard. It's also part of the fun of being a PM. And then the PM mindset, just a way to encapsulate all of the above. And this is the Amazon statement. It's always day one. No matter how advanced we are, how far we've come, if we think of this as day one, we're going to go further, faster in the future. So you reevaluate, define, and move forward again. And then the last slide I'll share, I won't walk through this, but if you have a look at the deck later on and would like to ask yourself or apply this framework to your team and want a little more guidance, here's a handful of questions to ask yourself and how you might move your team forward. And I will turn it back to Robin to take this an inch deeper.
Sure. Thank you, Mary. I think the one slide that really spoke to me a lot was really the PM mindset, being humble, curious, rigorous, always constantly trying to improve. I think in reality, those of us in the privacy space, historically, really have not had as much support and budget as maybe you might have in a product management function. So, it's shoestring budget trying to put something in. I think companies are starting to get more budget and resources to really improve our programs and think more like a product manager. But a lot of it in reality, GDPR, you're just, let's get something in there. Let's make sure we have a DSAR, like the spreadsheet example. So I think, this is really a timely, as the privacy environment just matures in general, and there's more tools and processes and regulations, really thinking about, whether you're a privacy tech company and constantly improving your product, or you're an internal practitioner around privacy, really thinking about continuously improving and how can you improve and scale. Especially, depending on the size of the company. Like if you're at a fast growing tech company, that's how it will be. So, okay, let's move on to the exercise. I put in a quick kind of just high level, some different privacy program work streams that you would need to think about as a privacy practitioner internally within a company. But I was hoping what we could do is someone could kind of throw out a process, a work stream, something they're struggling with, and we could walk through it using the product manager's mindset. Does anyone have an idea?
Or something you're struggling with at your company, or something you need to do in the next 6 months, but haven't started.
No one? No one.
Okay, how to integrate privacy requirements into procurement. Michael, can you be more specific about what type of privacy requirements? Are these your company's own internal standards? Are they legal requirements, combination of the above? Legal requirements. Mm-hmm. Robin, you want to run with it, or?
Sure. Yeah, that's a pretty big one. So, basically, I think, Michael, you're talking about, as you procure vendors, usually there's a procurement process at larger companies, and, there's a whole process in place where you need to get a contract in place with that vendor, and there's proper legal terms around privacy, security. There's also the vetting of that vendor you need to do. You need to look at their privacy practices and make sure that you feel comfortable sharing your personal information and sensitive data with that vendor. I think that's what you're referring to, right, Michael? Like both kind of the contractual side and the vendor review side. Okay, but let's go with that. That is a big one. I mean, every company should really have one of those processes if you don't already. So let's go to define the problem space. What are we doing here? I mean, we're basically trying to minimize risk, right? We want to ensure that the vendors that we're using have adequate privacy practices and they are contractually agreeing to it. So it's really about, minimizing risk. What are peers doing? I mean, this is kind of an interesting one. I know there are a lot of different tools out there. Privacy vendor review processes are generally kind of a general work stream within a privacy program. And there are tools that can help automate and scale that program, or you could think about building it internally using tools you have internally. But start, defining the problem space. Like, what are you trying to solve? You'd like to have, at the end of the day, every vendor that processes personally identifiable information vetted and reviewed, and you have a proper contract in place.
I'll add to this, sometimes as a product manager, you have external constraints and you're trying to build product within that set of external constraints. They can be anything from, we have a team of 2 engineers, and so we have to be really scrappy, to our infrastructure doesn't support this, so we need to build on the client side. It could be a whole host of things. And here, one of your constraints is getting guidance from the legal team. The legal team should give you boundaries on, these are the 5 things your contract needs to hit. They're probably going to also want to review every contract and put into place some sort of audit or guarantee process. And so they're not likely to tell you all of the things, but if you, because to be fair, from a legal perspective, the list is potentially infinite, but they can tell you the most important things, and then you can work together to align on what the actual constraints are and move forward, and then recalibrate and over time as you evaluate individual vendors. So that's just an example of a constraint that you're working within. That's part of the problem space definition.
Yep.
If there's more context you want to add, feel free to throw it into the chat. I think we can also give you speaking permissions too.
That is important too, Paul, is have the capacity to audit success with this in real time consistently. Okay, well, let's go ahead. Let's think about, going back into defining the problem space. Let's say, what's your short-term plan? putting in place privacy requirements with procurement and feeling confident that vendors are vetted properly on a regular basis and monitored as well. Let's go ahead to the next. Define your strategy. I think we touched on that a little bit. How are we going to accomplish the goal we've set out? People, processes, tooling. Start to think about, who are the different work streams that are included in the procurement process. I mean, generally, it's a pretty robust process at a company, including everyone from finance, legal, security, privacy. Sometimes there's a separate sourcing department, but really understanding who the different players are in this process. Thinking about people, who do you need from the privacy side to be providing the guidance and doing the actual work here, or how can you automate it? What tools are there that you could use? And this is where, there's a lot of third-party vendors you could potentially look at, or like I said, you could build it internally. Let's go to the next one. So what do you do first? This is what in the product management world, they call a PRD, or product requirements document. And that's where, they write down, and Mary, you can chime in, but basically all of the requirements of what you're trying to accomplish. What's the time frame you'd like to do this, and like really kind of writing down the entire user story of what you're trying to accomplish. So it would be, showing after this process was put in place that you have maybe, like when we go to our DSAR example, just have something in place. Or maybe you have something in place and you want to automate and scale and improve on it. But, wherever you're starting, write it down.
Since we're talking in the context of an operations program too, one of the goals that you can, one of the things that you can do in your so-called PRD is say, here are the things we're trying to accomplish. We want a 1-month review process where we get a yes or no from legal with an opportunity to course correct in the middle. We are able to give timely feedback to vendors on what our blockers are. We have a direct contact with the vendor legal team so that we can resolve problems quickly. And then when you go to operationalize things, because part of your work as an operations person and as a product manager isn't just to say what needs to be done, it's to help actually make it happen, to operationalize it. And so, let's say part 1 is you want to establish a 1-month review process with a definitive answer at the end of it. You then need to go out and get your legal team's agreement on that. And then you need to road test it. And so you're at the same time you're defining what, you're also exploring the how, just to add some color to what Robin was saying.
Yep. Yeah, Paul, I think that's a good point. Vendor RFPs as well, like doing a proof of concept with a vendor. You also want to be vetting their privacy practices during that time. So, but that's really where I think of the company I work for, Twilio. We do have a value. It's write it down. And that's where, I think the PRD is write down what you are trying to accomplish with this project or ask. Okay. And so, go ahead and then you start executing it and start working on the project and putting in place the product. And then also have a roadmap as well and start to think about what's your horizon? How can you kind of continuously improve this on a regular basis? And then what are your metrics and reporting that you need to report up? Mary, do you want to jump in on anything on this example?
Yeah, I think just the only thing I would add, just to add additional context, is that this is, the first line here says 1 to 2 year horizon, which means you are constantly reevaluating what metrics are working. You're always looking for opportunities to improve your process. So, hey, legal team, how can we make this easier on you? What pieces of the process can we cut out so that, or can we do for you? Or can we bring in an extra team to vet this for you and give you a summary? What can we do to cut down on every single thing? So you're constantly asking, where are the opportunities for efficiency? And you're asking that in a collaborative fashion with the people who are supporting you as you're operationalizing your program.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, good point, Kim. I mean, reporting, obviously, it depends on who you're reporting to, whether it's internal metrics for C-suite, operational metrics like SLAs for staffing. So it really depends on who the audience is.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the hard things about being a product manager is you are always communicating in a context, and that context is never the same from day to day. So when you're talking with engineers, you need to speak in one language, the language that they care about, that matters to them, that will help them contribute to your collective goals. When you speak to lawyers, you need to speak their language, to work with them in a way that helps them be a better partner, not overwhelming them, for example, with engineering details. And then, as Kim says, when you're working with the C-suite, they tend to want a completely different perspective on what you're doing. It's more a summary. Overall, what are the broad brushstrokes of how this are going? What are the things we need to do to improve? Where can you get into trouble? And what's the one thing you need that needs to keep you up at night? And by the way, here's also a reassurance that we're working on it. So it's working as a product manager is a constant exercise in recontextualizing everything you're doing, getting inside their head. And it's my favorite, one of my favorite parts of being a PM, because I like being a jack of all trades, but it's very challenging. And you're always communicating with a mind toward what your audience needs. And your audience is not the same from meeting to meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And Sanjana has a great question. Hi, Sanjana. She's actually on my team at Twilio. We've definitely researched this in the past, and metrics, there are some available historically, and the IAPP has had some sample decks of, what privacy metrics to report up to the board of directors. I think it's really internal to your company, like what are you trying to show? Who are your stakeholders? And then take the metrics from there. But there are some kind of best practices out there as well.
Let me share, I'm just going to talk off the top of my head, but privacy metrics, I've been doing privacy in a product and a policy context for an extraordinarily long time. And I will just say, this has been a topic at every single company I've worked at, and no one has ever come up with a good answer. But there are better and worse approaches, and a lot of it depends on your particular company and your particular goals. And remember on the first slide, I said, here's how simple it is in principle, but that actually coming up with a metric is one of the hardest problems, particularly in a privacy or like a trust management space.
Right.
But I've looked at everything from operational efficiency and operational cost. And that's just your internal measures of, are we getting this done as well as possible, but also as cheaply as possible? And where can we optimize that? What is our SLA? And then what is the satisfaction with the response? Does this meet people's needs? That's a huge clue. That is also a really tricky thing, because right now, I'd say for the last 5 years in the world, probably since around the time of Cambridge Analytica, people are just angry about privacy, and they should be. And so when you're measuring a sentiment metric, it's a challenging one, because there's a lot of emotion in it that people are taking out their frustrations about an entire tech industry that hasn't respected their privacy. They're taking out their emotions on your individual little 2-question survey. And so while that doesn't necessarily give you a super direct measure of your own efficiency, it gives you a baseline. And that is really helpful when you're trying to evaluate whether you've moved the needle. So sentiment and operational efficiency are two great things. You can also do big metrics like past an audit. We review, set your own individual team metrics, and these aren't necessarily the operational, we met the SLA, but we feel like we're moving the needle. We feel like we're working on what matters. So that's your team saying, I'm spinning my wheels on stupid processes versus I'm actually trying to solve a problem. And that's also another barometer. There are no perfect answers here, but I just wanted to throw out a handful of ways that I've seen this work well, and you just need to adjust and pick and choose. Yeah. If anyone else has other suggestions, throw them out. This is a really hard problem.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, because in the world of like financial reporting that I came from before I moved to the privacy world, there's standardized metrics that you analyze a publicly traded company on, or engineers kind of have SLAs and metrics, or even sales departments do. And maybe the privacy world in, several years will have more standardized metrics. I think the ones that are difficult are, increasing customers or improvement in trust. Like, it is hard to measure that because it's qualitative, not quantitative, or even reducing risk. There are frameworks out there where you can, can you reduce, and you show a reduction in risk by making sure you have a DSAR process in place and it's actually working efficiently. Yes, you can, but how can you show that to the right people?
let me play with this a little bit more too, because there's just so much here. Another avenue on this is take it from your customer or your user's perspective and set up metrics for that. So instead of how fast did we respond, it's how easy was it to make this request? Could I make the request that I wanted to make? Was it responded to an appropriate amount of time? And then you can measure your internal SLAs versus what people are saying. So just like we were talking about communications being contextualized, you can set up metrics that are contextualized. What's our internal operations efficiency from the internal perspective? What is our customer satisfaction perspective? Can they get through the process? Could they find the process? Could they complete the process? And then it goes from there. Then you can have something from your legal team's perspective. 90% of our contracts are audited every year, or we audit 30% of our vendors every 5 years just to make sure that they're honoring their promises. And so we're moving that through the process. And so, every 5 years or every 2 years, we'll catch a problem if it exists. Those are other ways to approach all of this. I'm just reading what Fiona said. Yeah, Fiona says there's so many types of companies, it's hard to generalize. So this is a highly contextualized thing. Your particular company is going to have a specific problem that it's trying to solve, and your metrics need to map to that. So that's why we can't say, here's what you do. This is the product management magic. It's how do you get into what we're actually trying to do and set up measures that matter to that specific thing that we're trying to accomplish. But if people want to throw out problems that they've got, we can brainstorm on metrics that might work, but we can also move on.
Well, we're almost to the end anyway of Q&A, so I'm welcome to talk on more questions and talk more about metrics. I think, Varun, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is for your question, like a startup versus a small size business, nonprofit, et cetera, for discussion. I'm sure there's standardized. I mean, a nonprofit's obviously a nonprofit company.
Let me riff on that a little bit. Maybe we can all get some conversation going. But if you look at privacy laws, and I'm strictly speaking in the US, and every country is different, and this is a little bit centric, but to the US, but usually a law will have a dividing line for this applies to companies who make above this amount of revenue, and it's for-profit companies, so it's not nonprofits, which, by the way, is a huge gap in privacy law because you get a lot of companies laundering their bad privacy practices through nonprofits. But there's always this question of, does this law apply to me, or at what point does this law apply to me? And it's appropriate to have different measures and programs for depending on where you fit within the eligibility criteria of the law. So I'm just a consummate privacy person. I care. I want to do it right. So I'm always aiming for doing more than the minimum, or at least setting up a program that aims for us delivering more than the minimum. But sometimes as a company, let's say you're a startup CEO and you have 3 contract employees and you're barely making it by, you might just want to work with that Excel spreadsheet and process your emails once a week. And that's a good start. Then as you grow, you scale your program.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from now, Varun, with your comments. I mean, yes, I would agree with that in an ideal world. In a realistic world, sometimes these companies don't have the budget to dedicate as much to privacy as like a larger company would. But maybe, if you look at where the security industry was 20 years ago, maybe the privacy industry will be there in 10 years as there's more budget and focus and minimizing risk due to new regulations around privacy.
I also want to add to Varun, I actually love it. I love this comment he made. He says, shouldn't privacy best practices apply to all smaller orgs? And just because you're a nonprofit and might be exempt from CCPA, that's not a great standing to avoid implementing the best practices. So yes. And now here you're running into my eternal conflict as an ethicist and as a product manager. As an ethicist, I want to have the highest ideals at all times. I always want to be aiming at an absolute best practice, a gold standard. As a product manager, sometimes you have to start from where you are. And that doesn't mean you can't aim for where you need to be, but you're not going to hit perfection on day one, particularly when you are a one-person startup and you are simultaneously doing the engineering and the marketing and the launches and the communications. Sometimes you just need to get started. And that doesn't mean that you can't have your eye on the gold standard. Where I get upset is when companies deliberately shoot for the absolute minimum that they have to do. And so that's a terrible practice from a product perspective. And it's a terrible practice from an ethics perspective. And if you can marry the two, where you start from where you are, but aim for higher, then that's the way to thread the needle, in my opinion. But I love that question, and thank you for having principles.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, being at like a fast growing startup, you might not have all the resources, and it's just about progress, not perfection. Is like the example before is using a spreadsheet, and then in the future scaling and improving on those programs. But in an ideal world, everything would be perfect and perfectly compliant from day one, so you don't incur debt and have to go back, like privacy tech debt, and have to go back and fix processes. But that's not always the case, unfortunately. Okay, how to measure cost of non-compliance. That's an interesting one. I mean, you could, I've done before at places, like done like a complete kind of risk analysis and like identified all the risks that could impact a privacy program and cost of non-compliance. So it could be, what's the litigation risks? What's the legal risk? Like how big could the fines be, right? Brand risk, loss of customers, PR risk. So if you really, map it out there, it's more than just with the potential fines, but there's a lot of other risks that you could really think about as well.
Okay, we've got a couple things. I want to play with, I want to comment on the cost of non-compliance, but I also want to play with Varun's idea about, the tools we can give an industry. So let me spitball on the cost of non-compliance. This is a really tricky thing. So that, this is in the context of the question of what are the right measures, and the cost of non-compliance tends to hit you all at once. You can go along for 10 years, like look at Facebook, until you can't anymore because you have a Cambridge Analytica, which makes the FTC take a much deeper look at you, which gets you a $5 billion fine. So sure, you can try to measure the cost of compliance, but the big problems come in, or cost of non-compliance, the big problems come in huge dumps. And those are the things that take down your business. A Facebook can weather that storm, and not that I think they should, but a startup, you can't handle a fine that is 5% of your revenue or 4% of your revenue, whatever it is. Let's see. Yeah, cost.
Yeah, I was thinking like if someone's ever done, like a cost benefit analysis, like if Cambridge Analytica had never happened and those fines, like what would have been the cost to just do it right up front versus the fines and the loss to customer trust and their brand and everything. Like
Let me give you an example. I'll give an example. So I literally worked at Facebook on privacy during Cambridge Analytica. So I'll share some stuff that's public. I can't talk about anything that isn't, but Facebook measures sentiment, user sentiment, huge operation around measuring how people feel about Facebook. It's been there forever. The person who hired me started the program. It's really smart. It's crazy. It's weird. It's got a lot of problems, but it's really smart. And around the time of Cambridge Analytica, so they're obviously one of the internal goals was increasing sentiment, positive sentiment toward Facebook. This is public. This is written about all over the place. And when Cambridge Analytica happened, the bottom fell out of the sentiment metrics. So that's publicly reported on as well. That's a major cost to your brand, but it's also a major cost to the internal teams that have spent 5 years building products that try to grow sentiment. So the bottom fell out, and that wasn't fun for anybody. But that was a very easy way to see the cost of non-compliance. Yep, Paul makes a really good point. There's also an opportunity cost. It's who are you not going to have as a customer because you made this mistake now? What's the future opportunity lost because of not aiming for the gold standard now? These things also come up over time. So we talked a minute ago about how the cost of non-compliance hits you all at once. Sometimes you see indicators like a company won't do a contract with you because your internal operations aren't strong enough. So that isn't a big public debacle that takes away 4% of your revenue, but it is a lost opportunity for business. And that is not the type of thing that tends to get published in a company. That tends to be kept in the C-suite, who are the only ones who know it, or the legal team who was processing it. So it's not always something you see inside of a company.
Right. All right, so we're at 12:10. We have 5 minutes left. Do you want to just go to the next slide? And then I think Really excited. We're having a great discussion here, but does anyone have any more specific questions or examples you want to walk through in the last 5 minutes here? We have you. Chief marketing officers? Yes. That's an interesting one. I actually have started, we have started to see the marketing team that I work closely with, really thinking more about privacy and focusing on privacy and learning more about privacy and kind of the marketing operations and sales operations suites and, a sales data governance or marketing operations, privacy compliance. That is a good point, Paul. Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, we can kind of go ahead and just wrap it up. But I want to make sure we're definitely here if someone else wants to jump in with some questions.
I'll stick around, for another 20 minutes if people want to talk. But I'm also, if I want people to ask any questions they've got, but if nobody has any, I wouldn't mind playing with Varun's earlier question about what free tools are out there. There are some. I can talk about free tools. I get to see all the people who are here. This is great. All right. So I started drafting something. I only got one thing written out, but one simple one is a consent management platform. If you're, I didn't know all these people were here. Hi, everyone. This is great. A consent management platform is used by website publishers to help serve notice to a user on, hey, this is the data we collect with cookies. Are you okay with this? Please register your choices. You've seen all these pop-ups. They're highly annoying. They're designed to be highly annoying, but that there are free and paid versions of that. That's one simple thing. And then there's an auditable trail that you've got. There are plenty of companies who are involved in the rise of privacy tech that offer free tools, but also paid tools. There are companies that help you do, let's see, like data minimization or segregation. You've got your Adobes of the world, and then you've got your small startups that help do this. If I'm drawing a complete blank on names right now. So if anyone wants to plug their startup, this is a great chance. There's opt-out processing tools. Any sort of batch email handling can be a great tool. You can get Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets plugins that just help you process. Yeah, cookie monitoring. Oh, privacy compliance checks. Thank you, Robin. Yep. Anyone want to plug any particular free ones? Oh, this is great. Okay, Varun says, I've been slowly building up a biased and limited template in Airtable to lightly automate reporting on data governance that now empowers DPAs, cookie tables, third-party provider lists, et cetera. We could even start a spreadsheet that crowdsources some of these. Do you want me to just start one now and pop it into the chat? Here, I'm going to do that.
Melanie, yeah, I see your question. I have noticed, since I've been in privacy, especially since GDPR, well, not so much GDPR, but really Cambridge Analytica. And I think COVID too, in a way, you do see people internally within companies more motivated to be compliant and understand and curious about privacy versus not thinking of just as a compliance thing, but really thinking about them, how it impacts them. I have seen that definitely more in the last year. And I'm sure a lot of my peers as well that are kind of in-house in privacy have seen that as well.
Okay, I started a spreadsheet. I'll pop anything that's in the chat into it. It's not even formatted yet, but it's great. People are populating. Thank you. I just saw Melanie's question, which I think Robin briefly touched on, but she asks, I'm curious if you've seen a difference in how non-privacy colleagues are motivated to prioritize privacy because of their experiences as a consumer versus internal messages about compliance. Okay, this is one of the constant challenges from a product management perspective. As a product manager, theoretically, my task is to think holistically about the health of my product and what it needs to move forward. So apply that to your privacy program. Realistically, what often happens is people think, I want to rocket ship my adoption of this product right now, get my promotion, and I'll worry about all the problems elsewhere later, including privacy. And so one of the things that I really try to do is a short version to Melanie's question. Yes, there's a huge internal variation on how people perceive privacy and their motivations to do anything to address it. It is highly common in organizations, particularly the larger ones, to see privacy as the most annoying cost of doing business and the thing that they are to deliver the absolute minimum on at all times, and with any luck, do it at the very last possible minute. So you'll notice that every company in the world, including Facebook, where I worked during GDPR, launched their GDPR efforts at the last minute. They had 2 years to prepare. There was a huge, massive internal scramble at every company in the world, and they were launched the day before, the week before, sometimes the week after. It varied. So my biggest challenge as a privacy pro who really cares and really wants to do the right thing is getting people motivated. And that's why that initial exercise that I talked about with defining your problem space is really important. And this is where you lay out the landscape of your product, your company, the problems you're trying to solve, and you get buy-in. So you openly ask questions in a way that invites people to participate, to poke holes. And if you do it right, and if you do it collaboratively, and if you do it the collaboration consistently, what you get at the end is a bunch of people, an entire team who is bought into the need to solve a problem. They understand why. This is not an easy thing to do, but I found that if I can do this at the beginning of every product process I begin, actually doing what is right and what matters later and having the buy-in of the team is much easier. Now, you might still get a CEO that comes in and says, do the bare minimum. You might have a CMO that comes in and does the same thing. But if you can get your team motivated around a problem, my consistent experience is people actually care. They want to feel like they're making a difference. And if you can show them that something matters, then they will go out of their way to make a difference. It's not perfect, but I'm sharing the tip that I've learned the hard way over almost 20 years doing this. Getting people to buy into the problem gets you a long way toward overcoming that internal resistance of this is too hard, this takes away from growth, this isn't fun, or this takes away from revenue, other general reticences. I'd love comments on that, what you've seen from the other side.
I think the buy-in is definitely really important. I mean, I think also, passion and education, really us privacy professionals trying to make it, more interesting and applicable, whether you're talking to a lawyer or you're talking to an engineer, is trying to make it more like understandable or explainable or relatable to people, and really kind of identifying with them, and then getting the buy-in as well.
This is always an interesting question to me, and I would really love to hear from other people who have struggled to get buy-in and where that came from, what motivated it, and ways that they got people past that.
I think one interesting point is that being at a B2B company where, you are selling products, is a little different than being at an ad tech company where it's a different sort of product. So B2B companies do have sometimes more of a motivation to really do privacy right. And you can get that buy-in from the top because it will lead to more customers.
Are any of you dealing with current challenges at your workplace that would be helpful to discuss? This could be product, process, or people. Varun, is that last comment you made, what vendors did we onboard in the last 6 months? Or I'm an eng manager. Are you trying to ask about how to motivate an engineering team to care? I'm not quite sure what you're saying there. Thank you for clarifying. He says, just an example of how to Trojan horse data privacy activity with real world problems that his colleagues face. Yep. There is real value, just from a product perspective, in pressure testing the stuff that you've built. So this comment is inspired by Varun's mention of a Trojan horse. So it's often easy to think that you're doing really well until you ask someone to come in and try to break your system or overwhelm your system or confound your process. And doing that is a really helpful way to identify how well you are doing and whether your metrics are genuinely evaluating the success of your program. It's also a pretty cool way to help motivate your team. Hey, we found a way that somebody can get around our process. Ooh, now we are all going to pull together and get ahead of that. So if you've ever worked in fraud, there's this real fun game of the fraudsters broke my system. Ooh, I'm going to get ahead of them. And then they get ahead of you. And it's this constant game. And sometimes gamification is a great way to motivate and keep people engaged. And you can use that to your advantage here. All right. Doesn't look like we have a lot more questions, but gladly we'll stick around. And if anyone wants to talk about their product, their company, their operations program, I think both Robin and I are willing to support and always love helping people.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining and the collaborative commentary. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with you and support other professionals in the space.
So we will stick around, but if you're done, you've seen the meat of this conversation. And it looks like Samir has a question. Vogel privacy. So I think Samir is asking a go-to-market marketing question. Could you explain what Vogel privacy does? One of the problems in this privacy space, and I'm sure the comms people who are here could write a book on this, but privacy is a very difficult concept to get across. And that's in part because it means something different to different people. I'm particularly interested personally in the history of privacy, but privacy means many different things to many different people in many different contexts. And so when you say something like you're building where did it go? A personal data privacy app, I don't know what that means without more explanation. And that means that your target audience won't know what that means without more explanation. So if you can say, I want to help people prevent companies from getting their data unless they actually need it, then that's a description. But if you're talking about something from a corporate perspective, it's a very different problem statement.
Yeah, I'm looking at the product. It definitely looks more consumer focused, right, Samir? So a consumer would download the app and then it would protect you could unlock your credit information. You could prevent data brokers from sharing information. And it looks like you could prevent Facebook and Google from sharing your data with advertisers. So it looks like more of a consumer product that you download from the App Store.
I think there's huge value in that. Figuring out how to get it through to consumers is always a huge challenge, particularly with the privacy fatigue people have from so many pop-ups. But making it seamless can be a good... Oh, wait, Melanie has free advice. Show this to congressional staffers so their bosses know how easy it is to do back on data broker lobbyists trying to prevent these standards from becoming required by regulation. Melanie is smart and you should listen to her.
Yeah, Samir, I'm thinking about your product, like how to kind of position it with an enterprise. I mean, I think it would probably most likely, like if you have a champion in the privacy, security, or IT space, they would be the one probably bringing it in and rolling out to the entire employee population. I'll use an example. When I was at Yahoo, I recall like everyone just wanted to use Slack, right? Like Slack was taking over the world instead of email. And so there was like all these different channels of like, everyone had their own Slack channel until the IT department was like, whoa, we have to be on like one Slack channel. And I think that was happening in a lot of places. But there was just so much adoption that it kind of took over everything. And so with a tool like this, I mean, you'd have to, I think, kind of position and find the IT team or the privacy team to protect the employees. Your buyer persona, that's what they call it in the marketing world. Like, who is your buyer persona?
Melanie has another free tip. Show this to CISOs who are trying to do this manually for all their execs and board members to prevent their personal accounts from getting popped and embarrassing the company. That is really smart. You could put out a YouTube video. You could do a Twitter series. There are ways to get this in front of founders or VCs who can put it in front of founders at scale. Make friends with EFF and Consumer Reports. Agreed. Okay, I think we're at time. Samir asks, can I ping you on LinkedIn? Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to reach out, everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate.
Melody's so funny.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hopefully you really enjoyed this. Mary, it was wonderful getting to know you and working on this panel with you. And thank you, everyone, for all of your great commentary and jumping in as well.
Agree. This is great. Thank you, everyone. It's really fun to hear your problems and what you're struggling with and how universal these challenges are, even at the same time that they're unique to your company.
All right. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.